start today with a bit of a case example because even though many who are interested in genetic counseling has a pretty good idea of what it is, it's always nice to get a bit of a different perspective, a more intimate perspective. So we're going to start with a case example. So here we have a 5-year-old boy with possible autism spectrum disorder, okay? And the kindergarten teacher voiced concern about poor eye contact and stereotypic hand movements. And the pediatrician, sorry, Megan? Okay. The pediatrician made a clinical genetics referral. Is that true? Sorry, this one? Okay, sorry everyone. Oh, I see. Okay, gotcha. I'm sorry, I'm just getting situated. Give me a second. All right. So when a patient is referred to clinical genetics, oftentimes they are met with the clinical geneticist as well as the genetic counselor, but it's very important in a clinical genetics practice to be evaluated by a clinical geneticist. So here we have poor eye contact, stereotypic hand movements, and the geneticist also noticed delayed walking and talking, as well as the additional findings on physical examination, such as a crooked fifth pinky finger, thin upper lip, a wide smile. But all of these features were present in the father. So more evaluation by clinical genetics often includes the family history. And this really is something that is typically done by a genetic counselor. So a comprehensive three-generation pedigree is obtained. And so what is it ultimately that we are doing in clinical genetics and genetic counseling? So as hopefully we all know, there are 46 chromosomes, 2 copies of every pair, so 23 pairs. The 23rd pair are the sex chromosomes. So this is a picture of a typical female karyotype because there are 2 X chromosomes. And so 46 chromosomes. And we also have, and this is an example of a male karyotype, so an XY indicates male. And along our genome, we have over 20,000 genes. And so, when a child or a family is referred to clinical genetics and undergoes an evaluation, and as well as a family history ascertainment, one of the things that is unbelievably important is a discussion about genetic testing, because oftentimes these families are looking for a diagnosis, and this diagnosis comes in the form of either molecular or chromosomal testing. And so some of these testing considerations that genetic counselors often are discussing with families have to do with the different types of results that can happen. So one of the type of result that can happen is a positive, and this definitely means implications for the patient and for the family. One possible result is a negative, and then we have to consider what are the next steps for testing. And then the third possibility is an uncertain significance. And then, of course, we're also left with wondering what are the next steps for testing, or just what are the next steps for this family in general. Also, a part of the testing process has to do with incidental findings. So discovering a result that we were not necessarily looking for, but that was resulted, as well as undisclosed family relationships such as misattributed paternity or consanguinity. So that is when the parents are related by blood. So these are all the different things that we are talking as genetic counselors, talking to families about when they are going through the diagnostic process and consideration of genetic testing. So going back to the 5-year-old boy who was referred for genetic testing, this family decided to pursue genetic testing, and a 700 kilobase deletion at chromosome 5q22 was identified. And the laboratory was able to determine just through research and databases that this deletion has been seen in people with autism spectrum disorder and developmental delay. but that this region also involves 4 genes, and one of those genes is called APC, which confers a risk for familial adenomatous polyposis, which is a high risk for colon cancer in both childhood and adulthood. And when someone has this gene mutation or even gene deletion, the recommendation are colonoscopies starting at age 10 and even potentially the removal of the colon. And so ultimately, what do you think is most important to communicate to this family? What is the most relevant for this patient? And what's the most relevant for the family? So I think that this really does ultimately highlight such that the families that we see in genetics are incredibly complex, and not only because of the issues that are happening with the families, but also the potential complications with genetic testing results. And so the next steps have to do with testing for parents, sisters, or other relatives. And for this family in particular, a letter to the school, as well as the identification of resources for both support of the family and for education. So that's just a very quick case example of a 5-year-old who was referred for essentially autism spectrum disorder, and really led down a path that I'm sure this family was not anticipating at all whatsoever. And that ultimately, in many, many ways, summarizes what it is that we do as genetic counselors. And so we do provide risk assessment, education, and support to individuals and families. We provide genetic and genomic expertise for the healthcare system. And I'm very happy to say that one of our strengths is the fact that we do effectively communicate with both patients and clinicians and really try to ultimately tailor the language that we use to both patients and clinicians. One of the things that is a very profound aspect of what it is that we do is interpreting genetic test results as well as the meaning of these results, right? So the implications to family members, the implications to the patients. And but we do function within a variety of specialties, such as prenatal, which is often referred to as reproductive, pediatrics, adult, cancer, industry and laboratory, specialty clinics, advocacy and education, as well as public health. So traditional areas of practice really have to do with prenatal or preconception, so reproductive, pediatrics, cancer, and adult. But our profession has expanded much over the last 5-10 years, and it continues to expand. And some of the areas of expertise and subspecialization that is becoming more and more frequent does have to do with cardiology, neurology, and psychiatry, and some non-clinical roles such as laboratory, business marketing, product development, medical science liaisons, variant interpretation, and research. So our program, it is a 70.5 credit program. It does span 21 months full time. 38.5 credits are specific to genetics and the Riggs School coursework. 26 credits are experiential, and 6 credits are awarded for the research thesis. Overall, year 1 is extremely course heavy, and year 2 is really focused on experiential and research. So for year 1, this is an overview of our curriculum. And so these are the primary counseling courses. Here in the fall, we have Genetic Counseling 1 and Medical Communication Counseling Theory and Skills. And in spring, we have Genetic Counseling 2. For genetics, genomics, and diagnosis, we have in the fall semester human molecular genetics, human embryology, and prenatal diagnosis, as well as genetic disease mechanisms. For healthcare principles in the first semester, we have clinical biostats, principles of public health. And For professional development, we have colloquium, journal club, case conference. For some reason, the colors are not, I'm so sorry, there we go. That wasn't working. I was like, something's not working right. So in the spring semester, as you can see, the counseling and communication, genetics, genomics, diagnosis, healthcare principles, professional development, as well as clinical fieldwork and activities really does span the entirety of the first year. In the spring of the first year is really when students start to get their feet wet with clinical fieldwork and activities. And some of those activities have to do with going to different industry or laboratory tours to get really an insider's perspective of what goes on in the laboratory, which is unbelievably important to the work that we do when we are patient interfacing. Students will be involved pretty heavily with standardized patient encounters. So actors will be brought in, and students will have that opportunity to practice their counseling skills one-on-one in various different types of scenarios, as well as getting out there in the field and observing or hopefully participating in some degree in clinical practice out in the field. Approximately 1 day a week. So these are not working. I'm sorry. There we go. I have to go forward and then go back. Sorry, everyone. These aren't working totally properly. But in the summer between the first and second year is really when clinical field work does begin, and we call it clinical genetic counseling fieldwork 1. It is an 8-week full-time placement, 40 hours per week. And it does continue in the second. I'm gonna move forward. There we go, let me go back. Okay, there we go. So this is an overview of the second year. So it is predominantly tailored towards field work. So as you can see on the bottom in the green, in the fall semester, you have field work 2 and 3, and each are 8 weeks in length, 3 days or 24 hours per week. So they are technically part-time, and it was designed that way so that students can focus their efforts on their research projects, which will absolutely take up a lot of time, and some additional coursework. So the psychosocial development 1 and 2 spans the entire year, and as well as the professional development does span the entirety of the second year, although those are they are not every week, they are approximately every 3 weeks, again, so that this really does maximize exposure to the field and working on research thesis. Okay, so we typically get a lot of questions about who do we participate with. So given that we are in Southern California, we really do have a plethora of really amazing clinical rotation sites. And so here highlighted are just some of them. So Children's Hospital of Los Angeles, Children's Hospital of Orange County, the Ridley Tree Cancer Center, which is in Santa Barbara. So our span is very, very far. We do go as far north, as far as Southern California goes. Our span goes up to Southern California and well into Orange County, Riverside County, and San Bernardino, as well as, of course, Los Angeles. And we do pretty much have affiliation agreements with most of the major medical centers here in Southern California. So I'm going to actually turn this over to Emily to talk about the research thesis, because at this moment in time, I do primarily oversee the clinical field work, and Emily does primarily oversee the research thesis. Alrighty, so as Ashley mentioned, this is, so students get credit for doing their research thesis in the second year, but really preparation for the thesis starts essentially upon admission into our program. We want students arriving day 1 in their first year, beginning to think about what they may want to do for their research. And this is, and the research thesis provides the opportunity for students to select a topic of their choice and take that role of, with guidance, of course, through a thesis committee, through a project of their interest. And the timeline is, so year 1, we have students currently are
First-year students are working on writing their literature reviews, so they are choosing topics that are of interest to them. In the second semester, they begin to put together their thesis committee, think through the methodologies that they want to use to address their research questions. And then the goal at the end of year one is to submit their project to the Institutional Review Board, the IRB, so that then over the summer, the IRB can review the protocol and then give either exemption or approval so that data collection can begin as early as the summer. So then in year two, we have that continuation, when students begin year two, continuing to collect and then analyzing their research data. And then that sets them up well for the second semester of year two to be ultimately writing up their results and then presenting that. So the end goal for students to meet completion of their master's thesis, they will submit both a manuscript as well as present a poster at our genetics research symposium. So we'll be having our first one this year in the spring because we'll be graduating our first cohort. And then nationally, after students leave KGI, we are strongly encouraging quality projects to be submitted for consideration at national conferences, and the National Society of Genetic Counselor Conference is an excellent opportunity for students to present their posters, or even in an oral platform. And then the ultimate goal, of course, always is, if you spend all that time doing the research, you want to be able to share your findings and reach the largest audience possible. And the best way to do that is to ultimately go forward with publishing in a peer-reviewed journal. And right now, the topics that we have that students are working on in their second year are issues related to cultural competency, access to care and genetic counseling services, pharmacogenomics, genetic counseling professional issues, decision-making, what goes into that decision-making process for clients as they're making decisions about testing, as well as we have a couple students who are very interested in that direct-to-consumer and more upcoming now patient-initiated testing. I'll pass it back to Ashley.
So ultimately, why KGI? What's KGI different? So as part of our consortium, so KGI is a part of the Claremont Consortium, which has just such a tremendous amount of resources. We have a prime location, being in Southern California and being the type of program that we are, we really have such a tremendous ability to be far-reaching in terms of clinical practice and the types of experiences that students are involved in. So one aspect could be a private practice, and then, at where there is one, let's say, maternal fetal medicine provider who is also board certified in genetics, and there's one genetic counselor providing all the services, then the next rotation could be even something at Cedars-Sinai where you have it at a major academic medical center, and there are 6 genetic counselors on that team. So really the diversity of genetic practices, likewise, Southern California in particular is such a culturally dynamic place, and being able to facilitate interactions with different clinicians and as well as provide care to patients, really learning about furthering your cultural engagement is a really, really wonderful advantage of this program's location. So we do offer unique course offerings in the flipped approach, and I'm really happy and proud to say that the vast majority of the genetic counseling curriculum is staffed and taught by practicing genetic counselors. And so this leads to the next one, which is genetic counseling and our specialized faculty. We really have such an incredible faculty that is so committed and so experienced.